might need a new excuse. Been waiting a while for something not attributed to you. When I need my fill, I'll get out my drill and tighten my grip. When you push too hard, I'll brace up my arms and give you the slip.
I'd say it's definitely an interest. I don't think we set out necessarily to say let's include an ambient track on our albums. I think it just happened, and in fact, on the first album, this is the first track, isn't it?
Yeah.
We just thought it worked well, and it's an ambient piano piece which is actually recorded live, and I think that almost just set the trend really for future albums. I'm a big fan of ambient music. I think Eric is as well, actually, but I'm particularly, some of my big influences are people like Howard Budd, Rogerino. So it's nice to sort of bring that angle into some of the albums, and I think that sort of not just the ambient tracks, but I think there's this definite ambient influence in a lot of the songs as well, and some of the sounds we use.
Yeah, and it gives it a different dimension having those ambient tracks in there, and some of them are some of our most popular. So the You Know Me Better Than I Know Myself from the second album is one of our most popular tracks, and that's a good point about the even if other tracks aren't ambient, there's an ambience in them, which John is very much responsible for, I would say. It's just an important part of what makes us, and perhaps that bit about what makes us distinct a little bit as well. Having that kind of ambient influence in there, and that's the extreme ends of what we do, because John's quite influenced by that sort of stuff, and I like, quite amongst other things, quite noisy, some heavier stuff, and so you get pulled in those different directions in terms of Copland and AIM in a good way. They're very important, the ambient tracks, and great for intro music for gigs.
Yes, yeah, definitely,
which is helpful. Yes and no, it's hard to say. I mean, I've had periods of so-called writer's block, but one thing that I've become to appreciate is that I don't get hung up about it anymore, and I always now have the confidence there's at least one more half-decent song in me, so I don't get pent up about it at all. So I can go months without writing a song, and that's fine, and then they might all come at once, and that's good. So I've become relaxed about it. Obviously, I tend to, the melodies do keep coming in terms of, having them there. And also, if I'm honest, because I did a lot of writing on my own and as a teenager and in my 20s, I've got a whole catalogue of stuff I sometimes draw upon, even if it's just a chord progression or a melody or something. So there are a couple of Cult and AIM songs which are sort of old songs of mine that we've kind of repurposed. So Unique is an example of that. There's another one called on the fingers of one thumb from Careful What You Wish For, so that sometimes happens. So I've become quite relaxed about it over the years, and I've relaxed into it. Just observation, really. Just observing things, observing situations, observing people, observing people's reaction to situations, you know. And I can link some of that stuff to my upbringing in terms of kind of being quite detached sometimes from situations and observing things. Although I'm German, my German skills are not perfect, so when we would be with relatives in Germany and they would be talking in German, I would be very self-conscious, I wouldn't say anything. So as a child, I often just sat silent for hours in these social situations. But I would be observing what's going on in terms of people's behaviour and body language and things like that, and I definitely think that has influenced me in terms of sometimes being quite detached in a social situation and hopefully trying to observe accurately or inaccurately what's going on. So I think that's part of it. So, to be honest, not all of those songs are written at night time. Sometimes I do write a song at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but I post it up at 1 o'clock in the morning. But predominantly, they are written at night. That's partly because I am a bit of a night owl, and I do stay up late at night. And also, sometimes it's just a practical thing. I'm not trying to over-romanticize it, but you know, you write songs when there's not much else to do. So when the life admin's done, and the washing up, and the cooking, and the cleaning, and all those sorts of things, then you know you're in a zone, in a place where you can do this stuff. So yeah, I do find it most productive, but there's some quite identifiable, specific reasons why that's the case, I would say. I wouldn't say, you know, it's not like I'm up every night, you know, with a quill and ink writing away. If I work on a song, I will continue working on it until it's done. So if I start a song at 2 in the morning, I will continue working on it until it's done. But they tend to be started a bit sooner than that. In terms of noting it down, what I tend to do, because my handwriting is terrible, I'm left-handed, is when I've scrawled it all down, that photo that you see posted up, I type it up with the chords straight away, and I record a version, usually quickly on guitar, into my phone, just so I capture the melody, capture the basic structure there and then that's fine, because like John, my memory is not the best either. So that tends to be the approach.
So by that, assume that we're talking about current music and current musicians that might influence us. Well, I try to a certain degree to keep up to speed, although most of my favourite music is from days gone by. But there are, if you look hard enough, there's some fantastic music being written out there. So there's some great Scottish bands, a mini scene in Scotland, bands like the Twilight Sad, Frightened Rabbit, to mention two, who I think are fantastic, very inspirational. There's seems to be a bit of a resurgence in ambient music, some ambient music that I quite like, which is quite current, like Nils Fram and Oliver Arnold are a couple that I really like. A Sheffield band, I believe they're from Sheffield, called I Like Trains. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're a bit of an inspiration currently. So there's some great music being written out there, but I think still my favourite is older music from my youth, shall I say. But yeah, if you look hard enough, you'll find some good stuff. Yeah,
and that's very interesting, because I hadn't heard of hardly any of those bands. I've heard of Frightened Rabbit, but I, on the other hand, I'm a bit of an insufferable, I am an insufferable record collecting geek. So most of my spare change goes, and so for me what's inspiring is just continuing that journey of finding new and obscure bands. I tend to collect, although it can be a wide-ish range of genres, stuff from sort of 1977 to 83. Almost everything in my collection is from that period. And what I love the most is when you discover a band you've never heard of from that time who've got a sizable discography. So that still inspires me. Just recently, just to give one example, there's a band I discovered called Kalahari Surfers, South African band, mainly one musician, and I really loved the stuff they did in the 80s. They did about 3 or 4 albums. I thought it was fantastic. And the stuff that inspires me now is still the stuff that inspired me as a teenager, in sense of some of my favourite bands, like The Residents. I'm a huge fan, and their use of melody has always fascinated me. And I'm still, rediscovering. When you've got bands with big discographies, you rediscover certain records at different times, and so some of the influences I had back then are still big influences now, I would say.
Yeah, just on that, I guess, just on discovering music, I think the amazing thing about music, I've sort of over the past few years got back into collecting vinyl, and one of the things that you can get very cheaply at the moment, I guess because not everybody wants it, is classical vinyl. So I've sort of spent the past few years scouring classical vinyl and frantically buying it up, and you can find there's some sort of pieces of classical music that I listen to now that I've never heard of, that are hundreds of years old, and I've only just discovered, and they've always been out there, and they're the most incredible pieces of music. So I guess that is one of the amazing things about music, is you never stop discovering it, and never stop letting it influence you.
Classical rare groove, they call it.
Yeah. Right, yeah, I'm glad somebody's noticed that. That's, I guess it is the classical training. One of my favourite composers, a guy called, still alive actually, an Estonian composer called Arvo Pärt. He big influence from an early age. He employs that, so I guess playing the same note, playing it differently, and that use of dynamics, and just demonstrating how different one note can sound. He's the master of that, and there's a nice little story about him that when he was 5 and he was growing up in Estonia, his parents' piano, pretty much the whole middle register was broken, so he had to learn on the top keys and the bottom keys, and because he did that, it really forced him to kind of play a reduced number of notes and kind of hear the quality of each note. So I kind of find that quite inspirational. And I guess classical music just generally has a lot of dynamic to it. I think that pretty much it is down to the classical training and some of the composers that have influenced me. Well, it's funny because I started using Kurzweil keyboards. I'm trying to think. I first got what was called a micro piano. I think around the time that Eric and I started to write music together as such. That sort of almost coincided with that time. That particular keyboard, I think it's kind of, I can't think of the words, but I sort of got a fondness for it because it's lived through so many lives. I think it's been present in every cult known that keyboard.
Yeah.
It survived, when I first bought it, it survived the fire as well. So
it survived Tuxedo Moon playing.
It survived Tuxedo Moon playing. It survived being, I think, smashed up in our American tour.
Yeah.
In the whole. But no joke, the first day that I bought it, I set it up and was playing on my headphones.
Survived being trapped in the case. Do you remember?
Yeah, it's been knocked over countless times. So I guess I kind of have a fondness for it in that way. It's like a sort of lucky charm or something. But also, it doesn't have many sounds to it, but the sounds are really good. So the piano sounds really good, the string sound is really good, and it's incredibly light as well. I've not found a keyboard as light as that one, so in terms of being practical, it's really good as well.
Yeah.
You can't get it anymore, I think. So
Yeah.
If this one is bust, I think you're going to struggle to get something new.
And I mean, you're using a few kind of plugins and other piano
Yeah.
sounds now.
Yeah. We've definitely expanded I think both of us have expanded our sound palette since those first two albums. So with that particular track, I mean, what we were meant to do actually, what we were thinking of doing at first, we were very generously donated that piece of equipment to use on the album, and initially the idea was just to record sounds and use them kind of as background for the different tracks we were writing. Came up with this idea of, well, why don't try writing a single track with the whole thing. I used it. I think I had it for about 3 or 4 weeks, and just thought I'll just record anything I hear that sounds good. So a lot of the background noises are. So I think there's a background of a park going on. There's a couple of moments where I had some records playing, and I literally just pressed play and got like a snippet of a Russian choir on a record, and some violin as well. The other thing I did with it was I think a bit influenced by John Cage and some of the classical musicians, more modern classical musicians that use prepared pianos. I thought it would be really cool to not just record the notes of the piano, but kind of get behind what's behind that note. So because it's so small, using a grand piano, I could do things like drop it in between strings and put it in between hammers and that sort of thing. And it came up, it just recorded these amazing sounds, which you don't really sound like a piano, but obviously, some of the kind of sounds and strings that are behind, what eventually comes into when you play a note on the piano. So we've got some great sounds using it. It's a very versatile little bit of equipment, that Olympus.
Yeah, and I was quite nervous how they'd react to it, really, because it wasn't really quite the brief they set us, but they loved it. And it's also, in the title, No Such Thing as Silence, which is really my input into it, is a direct reference to John Cage, which is one of John Cage's phrases, and a reference to 4 minutes 33 seconds. So, I think it turned out really, really well.
Yes.
Yeah. Great track. Well, we both contribute here. I tend to do the arpeggiators, sort of ticking, anything that kind of got a lot of movement in, I tend to stick in. The pads tend to be quite basic, the ones that I put in. I try not to, it's very difficult now to manage that process in terms of you've got such a world at your feet in terms of the possibilities. So, and it can be very confusing. So I try not to overthink it in terms of some of the choices that I make in terms of sounds.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that some of the choices can be a little bit overwhelming, particularly with software synths, that sort of thing. It can almost be quite addictive in some ways, buying new bits of software for sound. What I've tried to do with the sounds, certainly that I offer, is use a piece of software per album. So it gradually evolves. So I think it started particularly with Caligari actually. So Caligari, I used a bit of software called Absent 5, which restricts the number of sounds you can use and kind of gives it a bit of a style, a bit of a palette, and then moved on to another program for the next album and so on. So that kind of controls the choice a bit, I guess, and gives a bit of a theme. I think the early albums we didn't use so many sounds. I think it's something that probably has come since Caligari, I would say. We had a kind of smaller number of sounds that we used to use, but we've really opened that out actually over the past few albums.
Well, someone asked me the other day, I mean, Paper Raps Rock, the first album, we used 2 keyboards, that was it. The SP88, and I had an Ensoniq TS10 synth, which you hear for the first couple of albums, and then I've got something called a Korg M50, which I used for a few albums after that, and I've become a lot more kind of soft synth based now, if I'm honest. But that's kind of
the SP88 has only got something like 20 sounds on the whole keyboard.
Yeah.
Most of which sound pretty much the same.
Yeah, there's some good ones in there.
Yeah.
So that's, I mean, if it's related to a vocal, then that tends to be me. One thing I do like to do as a production technique is I often, actually more often than not, apply a different set of vocal effects to the chorus, to the verse. You know, I try and often I layer the chorus and I have an extra vocal part in there just to thicken it. But I tend to use a different delay or different reverb in the chorus than I do in the verse. And and with that particular example with Fly Me Ointment, it was just to kind of where I pitch it down as well. It was just to kind of just to mix it up a little bit. I think that's quite a nice way of there's no real reason to use the same reverb throughout with a particular vocal, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say you're probably the reverb one that's the master of the reverb as such. I mean, going back to techniques is perhaps more related to the sounds we use, but I do a lot of things like reversing of sounds and stuff, and adding reverb to it, taking a particular phrase from something we've done, and then so that sometimes adds a certain quality as well.
And something I've discovered in recent years, which is let you into a little secret, something called sample delay, which I've been using quite a lot more of, which is very helpful for making something sound very expansive, because it tricks your mind into thinking, tricks your ears essentially. I was talking to a friend of mine who is an ENT surgeon about that, and he said, oh, that's very good. He told me the scientific process that involves. But so there are a few things that have kind of come into our palette, if you like, in terms of effects over the years that I kind of draw on quite a lot. I like a lot of stereo delay as well. You'll notice, you know, the vocals, things going like that if you hear on headphones. So I'm quite fond of stereo delay rather than just a straight, what's called tape delay, which is in the centre. So I tend to use that a lot as well, because we like things to sound quite wide as a general rule. So that's where things like the right reverbs and effects can come in.
Well, I think that's probably a bit of both of us, really. Although I use a lot of, just going back to the ambient influence that we talked about earlier, I use a lot of ambient type sounds. One of the things I do is, so I sample sounds that I find a lot. So a big influence of mine is sacred music. So I tend to sample snippets of choirs that I find on records and short samples, and then use a lot of reverb and effects on those, and it creates this amazing subliminal sound, as you say, as using that word. So it's sort of finding what you can really, and then adding to the track in that way. But Eric as well, adds a lot of what you might call subliminal sounds, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's probably more you in terms of the subliminal synth noises and those things that are quite common across Colton and Aim songs. And what's interesting, and again this is to do with going back to how we were saying how you play piano and record and all the rest of it, is you use very consistent sounds, but you apply them quite freehand. You know, it's not like every 4 bars or every 8 bars, here comes a reversed choir, here comes a delay, so it just gives it a bit of glue that kind of glues the songs together, perhaps, across an album, for example. Whereas I thought, can sometimes I approach songs very independently and try and use different sounds in different songs, and sometimes that's good because it adds variety, but sometimes you need a bit of consistency there as well to kind of bring it together.
Yeah, we definitely have a sound palette, which we is our trademark. I think I heard an interview you did once actually when you talked about R&D.
Yes.
Who used that approach.
Yeah, I interviewed Paul Humphreys in his house once, about 10 years ago, and of OMD, and he said it's very important. One of the approaches OMD have is that they have a palette of sounds at the beginning of each album, and they apply that to each album, and you can really hear that. If anyone's very familiar with OMD, you can really hear that in OMD. If you think of an album like Junk Culture from 1984, has a very distinct palette of sounds from that album, which is totally different from Dazzle Ships, which is what a year or 18 months before. So that's interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting approach. Well, I mean, yeah, it's nice to add a bit of variety, first of all. Obviously, the guest artists do things that we're unable to do or unable to do adequately. So in the case of John Ellis, I mean, guitar, you know, I'm nowhere near as good enough a guitarist to add half-decent guitar parts to our songs. And synthesized guitar, sample guitar doesn't really work very well unless it's just looped. So you've got to get a real guitarist. Obviously, I can't do what Kelly does. In terms of how, and a violin as well, it's tricky to get synthesized or violin that isn't real right. You know, I think there's a track on the new album actually, where it does sound actually very authentic, but it is hard to certainly solo violin to pull that off without having a real violin player. In terms of how we met different people, John Ellis, I was a big fan of I am a massive fan of the Stranglers growing up, and I got to know him through MySpace actually, and that was around sort of messaging. We exchanged a few messages, and I found out he lives quite local to us actually, and sort of met up with him, went from there really, and he's been a great supporter of our music, and we're grateful to that. Kelly, she was a friend of, or a very good friend of mine, interviewed her for a magazine, the same magazine that I interviewed OMD for, and they became friends. And one day he was playing our second album, Careful What You Wish For, in the background one day while she was around having a cup of tea or whatever, and she said, "Oh, what's this? This is amazing." He said, "Oh, this is my mate's band. It's called CWNN." She said, "Oh, great." And I think he lent her the album, and she absolutely loves it. And I believe Careful What You Wish For is still one of her favourite albums, and we've developed that amazing working relationship. And with likes of Blaine and Tuxedo Moon, again, I was a big fan. It's fulfilling the fantasy of having some of your heroes, really, in some cases, play on your record. So Tuxedo Moon, big influence on me in particular. And just, you know, I met them because I put on a gig for them in London. I helped put on a gig for them in London in 2004. And we kind of stayed in touch and became friends. And that's how that relationship came about. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of sort of samples versus real musicians. I mean, we do use sometimes samples of real musicians. So the track that Eric mentioned on the new album is sampled, real sampled violin. But I find that when you do that, you're often making compromises. Even if you love the sound of the sample, you're having to kind of bend the track a bit around the sample that you find. And one of the great things about using the likes of Blaine and Stephen and Kelly is that they're fantastic musicians and they run with it, but they come up with, you know, present them with a track, and we give them quite a lot of freedom, and often they come up with these sort of genius moments off the back of presenting them with a track, and you can't beat that dynamic of a real musician, really. So we do try, and very fortunate to have them. We try and use it as much as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. You need to work with musicians that you don't have to direct too much, you know, that can add their own, because you love what they do in the first place. If you love what they do in the first place, you want their personality added to your record, you know, essentially. We'd always choose people for that reason.
Yeah, I don't think we've ever really dictated.
There's not really. There are a couple of times where I've had to be a bit more specific with people, but not with Blaine, Stephen, Kelly or John, that's for sure. Well, you know, I am obviously interested in the art, if you like, of songwriting, and I'm very interested in melody and inventive and unusual melodies. I'm drawn to, I like childlike melodies, I like nursery rhymey melodies in music, and I also really like unusual and weird melodies. And that's probably why I like The Residents a lot, because although they're very avant-garde and some of it's very hard going, they're actually highly melodic in what they do. It's just very weird, unusual melodies, and I like that. And I think I've listened to them enough and other people that unusual sense of melody has kind of infused me a little bit. And also because, like I say, often the way I write now is I think of a melody in my head and I record it on my phone. It doesn't always used to be that way, but now that tends to be the way I write. That's quite a freeing way, that's quite a free way to write, because then the melody is first. You're not thinking of the restrictions of what key it's in and what chord it suits and all the rest of it, so that's nice. And then song structures, I'm interested in song structure. I told you I'm quite mathematical in the way I approach song structures, but there's a few little trademarks, like I like to repeat things 3 times rather than 2 times or 4 times, because that's just so predictable. And often when I hear records, I always think, why did you repeat that 4 times? It's just so predictable, do it 3 times. So you'll find that, if you listen to a lot of CWNN things, that things get repeated 3 times before it moves on to the next section. And just admiring unusual song structures, I think Bowie is a great example of someone that's structured, obviously an incredibly gifted songwriter and talented writer of pop music amongst many other things, but he used structure in a very, very unusual way. You just have to look at songs like Breaking Glass. Well, there's a really good example of a song called Everyone Says Hi from the album Heathen, which is a pure pop record, but the structure of it is really bizarre. It's not the way you would logically structure it, but it makes it more interesting. So it's that interface really between trying to have a melody that's a bit unique and trying to structure the song in an interesting, possibly unpredictable way. The other final thing to say on that is a lot of our songs end on what's called a button ending, which means they end rather than fade out. Nearly all of our songs do that. In the beginning, that was because for the first album, nearly all of those songs we played live. So because we played them live, we'd arranged them for a live context, so they end bang. But it's sort of become a bit of a trademark, and I've started to actually have a bit of an aversion to songs that fade out for some reason. I almost feel like they're unfinished, or if you've run out of ideas, then we fade it out. So it's quite rare now that you find a CWNN song that fades out. It'll just become a bit of a unexpected trademark, if you like. I don't know if I have a unique vocal style or delivery. I just think it's taken a while, but I've found the voice that I have. I squirm at some of the early vocal performances on CWNN records, particularly the first album. I didn't know what my voice was at that time, and I've just learnt to know what the limits of it are. And I think that's you've got to, by playing to your strength, you're playing to your limits. By not doing something you're not comfortable with. So I've learnt I have quite a limited range, and that's fine, and I'm comfortable with that. I can't hold a note for very long either, but there's a tone to the voice, and I think that's the thing that makes the difference, isn't it? It's the character, it's the tone of the voice. I love the human voice as an instrument, and it's the only instrument in the world that has over 8 billion different settings, because every single person's voice is unique. Yeah. And so I don't try and be someone else, and I think it's important to do that, just to play to your limits. In terms of influences, I mean, there are influences, but I could never reach those kind of standing. Billy Mackenzie of the Associates. I love Hugh Cornwell in terms of the tone of his voice. Captain Beefheart because of the power and the range and stuff, just really technical level. I like a lot of female singers as well, but I'm not trying to be another singer, that's for sure, because I probably wouldn't make a very good job of it.
Well, I'll start with pianists. I think I mentioned earlier on Elton John. So it's one of my earliest musical memories was listening to early Elton John records from a young age. My dad had quite a big Elton John collection. So particularly records like Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, some of the early ones before that. He has a particular, I'm not a fan of him post 1980 particularly, but certainly in his early days, he had a brilliant voice, but also quite a unique way of playing. He's got small hands. I've got small hands as well. So the way he plays, he sort of had to adapt to his hand size. I've had to do that a bit as well. So it's been sort of relatively easy to have him as an influence, just based on hand size, I guess, and the way he plays. But in terms of other pianists, I don't kind of pick them up really. So certainly I've got more into jazz piano over the years. So something like Bill Evans, love Bill Evans, fantastic. Sort of listening to that a bit more. And then I kind of guess not so much pianists, but keyboard players who you wouldn't consider technically amazing, but somebody like PJ Moore from the Blue Nile, has this incredible sound palette and uses really unusual sounds on the keyboards, quite sort of atmospheric and ambient, and at times almost classical as well. And then in terms of composers, I'm a big fan of I guess late romantic era classical music. So some of the English composers like Vaughan Williams and Elgar, and like Vaughan Williams, just some of the chords that he comes up with and some of the moments he comes up with are so as evocative as you can get, and almost painterly actually in the way that he composes. They're just really powerful pieces of music that instantly conjure up imagery, I guess. And then of course I mentioned Arvo Part, so he's been a big fan of his music since I was fairly young as well.
I see the prize, your prying eyes, I know. I'll reach out and I won't let go. So where's something real? I'll chase it down, through town to town, I'll pass until it's firmly in my grasp. Put your trust in me.